It marks 126 years since the first black priest in the U.S. passed away, and that's why hundreds walked in his honor today. Father Tolton was born into slavery before calling Quincy home. His followers went from St. Peter Catholic Church to St. Peter's Catholic Cemetery, where Tolton is buried. He is in the process of achieving sainthood. Right now, he's recognized as a venerable servant of God, which is the second of 4 steps. That process has been in the works since 2010.
I just encourage everybody to look into Father Tolton's life. His life is not a long one by our standards, but is a deeply moving one. The way that he overcame adversity, the way he overcame discrimination, the way that he tried to meet everyone and encounter them as if he was encountering Christ. His example is one very much needed today.
After several years in Quincy, Tolton transferred to Chicago before dying in 1897. Father Zanley says there's no telling when he might achieve sainthood.